I froze when I came back from the bathroom at the company party and saw my wife kissing her boss, the betrayal naked and raw right in front of me, shameless, merciless, as if I had never existed, as if years of history could be erased with a sip of wine and a cheap smile. My eyes didn't blink, my legs locked. She was there, surrendered, laughing, with her fingers on his collar, while he slid his hand around her waist as if he already knew every detail of the body that, until yesterday, had been sleeping next to me. The sound around me was muffled, the applause, the conversations, the toasts, everything went silent. All I could hear was my heart beating like a desperate siren, like a dry punch that wouldn't stop hitting me in the chest. And in that second when our eyes met, I saw the fright, the guilt, the feigned desperation written all over her face. But I didn't make a fuss. I just took a deep breath, turned around and smiled, a smile that wasn't mine. A smile that was born from the depths of pain, anger, and the certainty that I would still have my turn. That night, while she looked for me in the middle of the room, with that pale face and expression of someone expecting pity, I just kept quiet, watching. I heard the apologies I didn't ask for, the stutters that didn't interest me, and I responded with a silence that devoured her more than any shout. Her boss, haughty, pretended to be professional, adjusting his tie, trying to hide the tension, but the sweat betrayed his fear. A fear that he still couldn't justify, but that he would soon understand with every cell in his body. I spent the next few days smiling at everyone in the office, meeting deadlines, praising ideas, and wearing a mask of normality that confused even myself. But inside, every word and every gesture was calculated. A plan was being born. A cold, silent plan, built with patience and precision. I discovered secrets that were hidden in emails, in contracts signed in a hurry, in files forgotten in restricted folders. I pulled threads, connected loose ends, and more the image of my betrayer took shape. Not as my wife's lover, but as a dangerous, corrupt man who built his career on fraud and manipulation. She, on the other hand, tried to rescue the facade of a loving wife. She came home with gifts without dates, soulless smiles, caresses that no longer touched me. She talked about dinners, trips, children, as if the last few weeks had not been swallowed up by that kiss. But the truth was there, glued to my gaze. She knew that I knew. And that consumed her more than any confrontation. I let her sink alone, I watched each attempt at reconquest like someone watching a poorly rehearsed play, while behind the curtains, I wrote the final act. What they didn't know was that I was never in a hurry. I wanted the fall to be slow, painful, memorable. I wanted them to feel every shard of the destruction they had caused, not only to my marriage, but to trust, respect, and dignity. And that was when I discovered his weak spot, a hidden financial transaction, camouflaged in fictitious contracts, in an account that shouldn't exist. And there, in that detail, I saw the perfect opportunity. I gathered evidence, talked to the right people, and set the right moment. And when everything was ready, I took the first step. I invited them both to a get-together, something small, informal, just us and a few close colleagues. She was excited, she thought I was giving in, that I was finally ready to forget, to forgive. Her lover, cautious but convinced of his immunity, accepted. And on the agreed night, under the warm lights of a room I had decorated, with soft music playing in the background, I revealed each of the pieces of evidence I had gathered. Face to face with their mistakes, their lies, their betrayals, the ground disappeared beneath their feet. There was no denying it. There was nowhere to run. The silence was broken by a single sentence of mine, "This is just the beginning." Days later, the investigation officially began. He was removed from his position, the press found out, his name was smeared in all the headlines. The company collapsed internally, emergency meetings were held, and panic spread. And she? She lost everything. She lost her family's trust, she lost her job by association, she lost her footing. She tried to come back, she tried to argue that she had been deceived, that she didn't know, that what she had with him was just passion, a slip-up, an escape. But it was too late. My absence spoke louder than any answer. And little by little, she understood the true meaning of loneliness. I still remember the day she came to me, eyes red, voice trembling, holding a letter in her hand. "I just want you to listen to me." But I had already heard everything I needed to, long before the kiss, long before the party. I heard it in the way she avoided me, in the silences that once were comfort and later became walls. I heard it in the lack of affection, in the disinterest, in the empty excuses. I heard the end long before it announced itself. And in that moment, looking at her without pain, without anger, only with a serenity that she did not recognize, I realized that revenge was already complete. Not because she suffered, but because I was free. And the most curious thing of all, which I never told anyone, is that the biggest turnaround in history was yet to come. Because among the rubble of betrayal, among ruin and coldness, I found something I never expected, a new version of myself, stronger, more lucid, more relentless. And maybe, just maybe, also a new chance for love. But that, of course, is a part of the story she will never know. And there is one detail about all this that has never left my mind, a coincidence that was revealed too late for them, but at just the right time for me. Something that, when it happened, made me laugh alone in the midst of the chaos, as if the universe had decided to participate in my revenge. An event so precise, so unexpected, that it completely changed the course of the consequences. But that part, only those who stay until the end will understand. Welcome to the channel. Here, none form of betrayal is romanticized, we condemn any and all infidelity. The stories you will hear are fictional, but loaded with emotional truths. Our purpose is clear, to show how betrayal can destroy homes, hearts and entire futures. Get ready for an intense experience. Feel every emotion. Now take a deep breath. The story will begin, and it will tell you shock. They were the kind of couple that seemed to have formed the right balance between affection and ambition. Ethan and Laura met on a strategic leadership extension course promoted by the company where they worked, at the beginning of their careers. They were both young, determined, with that restless sparkle in their eyes of someone who wants to go far. He, a data analyst, methodical, with impeccable logic and rare calm for his age. She, from the communications sector, spontaneous, eloquent, with a natural charm and quick thinking that always made her stand out in meetings. It wasn't long before their eyes met more often than necessary, and little by little, 5-minute coffees turned into long post-workout dinners. It took 8 months for them to publicly admit that they were together, and since then they seemed inseparable, a kind of balanced partnership between rationality and emotion that aroused admiration among their closest colleagues. They were married 4 years later in a discreet ceremony in a garden far from the city, surrounded only by close friends and family. There was no ostentation, just whispered promises and trembling hands that intertwined for a life that they both believed would be built on mutual respect and shared achievements. Their first house, a simple but cozy 2-story house, was renovated over the weekends with brushstrokes of paint and laughter. Saturday nights were dedicated to old movies and improvised recipes, and even when the bills were tight or the boss was too demanding, there was always a comforting smile at the end of the day, a word that calmed, a hug that said, "We're together." Time, however, is not kind to monotony, and routine, with its silent demands, began to fill in the gaps. Ethan was promoted to analysis coordinator and began to spend more time away from home, traveling frequently to implement new systems in branches. Laura, in turn, received an offer to work directly for the company's presidency, as the CEO's image advisor, which meant being involved in high-level decisions, strategic meetings and corporate events where appearance and speech had to be impeccable. It was a professional achievement that she welcomed with enthusiasm, but it silently began to distance her from the simple and predictable universe that she shared with Ethan. Mornings became silent, with hurried exchanges of kisses at the door and reminders stuck on the refrigerator. Dinner together became an exception, and topics were limited to the week's logistics or car maintenance. Still, there was a habitual kindness between them that left no room for suspicion. Ethan was the kind of man who believed that love was built more on daily details than grand declarations. He still left a note when he had to leave early, still stopped by Laura's favorite cafe to bring her apricot croissant when he came back from a trip. As for her, even immersed in the demands of her new position, she tried to maintain her Sunday ritual, waking up without rushing, making pancakes and listening to music while they cleaned the house together. Nothing seemed out of place, even though the two began to lose each other in almost imperceptible details. Laura, now circulating among the company's top executives, began to attend dinners, conferences and corporate parties more regularly. She learned to deal with the pressure of competitive environments, to modulate her voice, adjust her smile and maintain her posture even in the midst of sexist comments disguised as compliments. She was on the rise, she was admired, her presence made its mark. It was impossible not to notice her in the hallways with her elegant heels and her confident speech. Ethan followed everything from a distance with genuine pride. He thought she deserved that recognition and always said that she was born to shine. But, over time, Laura's eyes seemed to look beyond the domestic horizon they had built together, as if what now united them was just a polished memory that they both held on to out of habit. The company where they worked was a growing powerhouse. The glass-enclosed building reflected the ambition of its leaders, and the glass-walled rooms exposed not only the meetings, but also the vanities and power plays. Laura became a trusted figure for the president, a charismatic, soft-spoken man with a dubious reputation behind the scenes. He was known for his talent for manipulating words and people, for knowing exactly how to deliver what someone needed to hear, and for maintaining a select circle of employees who orbited around him like seduced satellites. Laura gradually became part of this circle. Invitations to exclusive lunches, last-minute trips to attend events, private meetings to discuss strategic images, became part of her routine. And although she always appeared professional, there was something about that closeness that made her most attentive colleagues uncomfortable, even though none of them dared to say it out loud. Ethan, on the other hand, remained dedicated to his department, oblivious to the rumors that ran through the corridors like hushed whispers. His reserved attitude made him one of the few who did not participate in the gossip. He was respected for his competence, but also seen as someone who was distant from the political game that moved the highest positions. His focus was elsewhere, ensuring perfect deliveries, keeping the department running with precision and, above all, protecting what he had built alongside the woman he still loved deeply, even if the intimacy between them had been replaced by an almost fraternal coexistence. The distance between them grew subtly, like a crack growing silently in concrete. Small changes in behavior began to emerge. Laura started sleeping later, claiming she needed to finish urgent reports. Ethan, noticing her evasive glances and short answers, sought in her gestures a reconnection that seemed increasingly distant. Some nights, he would wake up and find her sitting on the couch, alone, staring into space, as if she were somewhere else. When he asked if everything was okay, he would receive a fragile smile and a, "I'm just tired." He wanted to believe her, needed to believe her. Even at company events, where they used to make a point of arriving together, it was now common to see her arrive alone, saying that Ethan had urgent commitments or that she didn't feel comfortable in those environments. Her absences began to seem normal, even expected. But what no one saw was Ethan's silent effort to keep the wheels of their relationship turning. He tried to plan short trips for the weekend, suggested going out to dinner or just walking through the park where they used to talk for hours when they were still just two colleagues with dreams in their pockets. Laura, however, always had an excuse ready, an urgent delivery, an email that needed to be answered, a meeting with the CEO that had been rescheduled at the last minute. Ethan listened, understood, accepted. That was the kind of man he was, patient, trusting. And perhaps precisely because of that, he didn't realize how much distance had already grown between them, and that the love that once united them was beginning to be confused with memories. The truth is that they were both changing. Ethan still believed in marriage as a covenant built day by day. Laura, on the other hand, seemed to be in a silent process of transformation, as if she were moving away not only from the relationship, but from the woman she had been by his side. There was a new restlessness in her eyes, a thirst for something that she couldn't even name, but that made her question whether that safe, linear life still satisfied her. But there was no confession, no fighting. The house remained tidy, birthdays remembered, bills divided. It was as if they both lived inside a seemingly stable bubble, ignoring the signs that something deeper was unraveling within. And it is in this scenario of polite silence, of routines preserved for convenience, of unresolved feelings camouflaged by professional commitments, that this story begins. A story where nothing is what it seems at first glance, where the strongest bonds can be slowly eroded without anyone noticing, and where the true impact of a betrayal is not only in the moment it occurs, but in the way it changes forever the view of the person who was betrayed. The corporate environment became increasingly intense as the company gained national visibility. Ethan spent his days immersed in spreadsheets, algorithms, and meetings that seemed to never end, while Laura moved through glass rooms and formal events, her presence required as a representative of refined and strategic communication. The difference between the universes they inhabited became more evident with each week. He still believed in the idea that their success would be shared with pride, but he did not realize that the steps Laura was climbing were built on distances that were increasingly difficult to overcome. Attempts to reconnect were becoming solitary efforts. Conversations that were once natural now felt like interviews. Touches were rare. Laughter was scarce. She became a more polished, more sophisticated, but less accessible version. He remained constant, the same man who had painted the living room wall on Sundays, but now with a hidden tiredness in his eyes and a silence that followed him like a shadow. In the company hallways, certain glances began to linger longer, conversations more hushed, smiles more loaded with subtext. The closeness between Laura and the CEO intensified noticeably, even among those who avoided speculation. It was common to see them leaving meetings together, laughing complicitly, exchanging glances that said more than words. Ethan, despite being oblivious to these signs, began to feel something he had never experienced before: doubt. It wasn't ordinary jealousy, it was a silent discomfort that lodged itself deep in his stomach and that manifested itself in subtle details. When he asked about the meetings, Laura would answer vaguely, look away, say it was just work, that he was imagining things. And he wanted to believe. He always wanted to believe. Their wedding anniversary, which had been sacred to both of them, was forgotten by her that year. Ethan prepared dinner at home, put on a song they used to listen to in their early years together, and waited. She arrived late, exhausted, explaining that an emergency meeting had gone on longer than expected. He smiled sadly, blew out the candles on the table, and said it was okay, that they could celebrate the next day. Laura, in turn, seemed relieved that she didn't have to pretend to be excited. That night, they slept facing each other, but without touching. Ethan, with his eyes open, stared at the ceiling as he felt that something had definitely broken. He didn't know what or when, but he was sure that they were no longer in the same place. With the end of the quarter came the traditional company party, an event awaited by everyone, filled with champagne, live music and motivational speeches. Ethan hesitated to go, but decided to accompany Laura at her insistence. They arrived together, as a couple, but she soon moved away to greet her superiors and make her usual social rounds. Ethan took refuge in a discreet corner, observing everything with attentive eyes. The party was lively, the loud music drowned out the whispers, but nothing prevented a clear view of what was happening around. He drank slowly, trying to feel part of that environment that he no longer recognized. Laura, impeccable in her dark dress, exuded confidence. The CEO was close to her almost all the time, and although she avoided more daring touches, there was an invisible, almost intimate language between them that did not go unnoticed by anyone who knew where to look. At one point, Ethan walked away to go to the bathroom. He wanted to clear his head, wash his face, try to convince himself that he was overreacting, that it was all the result of a passing insecurity. He stayed there for a few minutes, breathing deeply, looking at himself in the mirror, trying to find the man who had gotten lost in the routine. When he returned to the salon, time seemed to slow down. The music, the lights, the laughter, everything faded into the background as his eyes met the scene that would change his life. She was there, his wife, the woman he loved, who he respected, who he had defended even from himself in moments of uncertainty, in the arms of his boss. It wasn't a formal hug, it wasn't a mistake in perspective. It was a kiss. A long kiss that said it all. Her eyes were closed, his hand resting firmly on the base of her spine, as if he had done it countless times before. A kiss that only happens when you've lost the fear of discovery. Ethan didn't react as they might have expected. There were no screams, no glasses thrown, no scene. Just a devastating silence. A step back. A world crumbling inside while the body remained motionless. A heat on the back of her neck, a pain in her chest that was physical, a lump in her throat that prevented any words from coming out. His gaze met hers, and for a second, they both froze. She, pale, tried to hide it, adjusting her dress as if it were possible to erase what had just happened. He just stared at her for a few more seconds, then turned his back and left the room. There was nothing more to be said. Not here. Not that night. Outside, the cold night air cut through his skin like a blade. His breathing was heavy, his heart racing. He walked aimlessly for a few blocks, not knowing where he was, not knowing who he was. The image of that kiss repeated itself in his mind like a scratched film, playing over and over. It was as if something inside him had irreversibly broken. A mixture of anger, disbelief and deep sadness dominated him. More than the betrayal itself, what hurt was the knowledge that everything he had built had been undone without warning. The complicity, the plans, the gestures, everything had been replaced by well-disguised lies. In the following days, Ethan didn't say a word. He maintained an appearance of normality, but inside him something was turning into silence. Laura tried to talk, tried to justify it with broken sentences, said that things had gotten out of control, that it wasn't what it seemed, that she needed to explain. But he didn't want explanations. Not at that moment. His silence consumed her more than any argument. Every cold gesture, every lack of response, every look away was a sentence. She still tried to bring up everyday matters, as if a simple conversation could heal the open wound, but the house had become a minefield. They passed each other in the hallways like strangers. The dinner table, once a space for laughter and confidences, was now an altar of silence. Time began to flow differently. Ethan, on the outside, was the same, competent, polite, calm. On the inside, his world was being reorganized. But not with pain, with planning. It was as if each piece was being reassembled into something bigger. He began to investigate, observe, connect dots that had previously seemed random. Schedules, access to systems, corporate expenses. Laura didn't notice, she thought his silence was resignation. What she didn't know was that, behind that neutral look, there was a storm about to break out. And in the center of that storm, something much bigger than betrayal was about to be revealed. Something she could never have imagined. And at the exact moment when I thought he was pulling away out of weakness, he would take the first step back. But not to where they were before. To new ground, where the consequences would come like waves and sweep away everything that was poorly established. What Laura didn't know was that the betrayal she had imposed would only be the beginning of something much bigger, of a silent movement that was already underway, and that would bring to light truths that would change everything definitively. On the morning when everything really began to change, Ethan was sitting alone on the back porch of the house he had once renovated with his own hands. His cup of coffee was growing cold without being touched, his gaze fixed on the horizon, not seeking any view. The silence around him was not that of peace, but of restraint before an earthquake. There, faced with the certainty of betrayal and denial by the woman with whom he had shared dreams for years, he made the decision that would change everything. He would not scream, he would not shrink in a fit of blind rage. He did not want just emotional justice, he wanted the truth exposed with surgical coldness. This was the kind of revenge he wanted, the kind that does not require a single word to do damage. That same afternoon, he gathered documents, cross-referenced data, and when he accessed the company's internal directory with a password that only a few knew, he found what seemed to be the first link in the chain. Duplicate contracts, inflated values, internal transfers with flimsy justifications. So far, nothing directly compromising, but enough to make him suspicious. He spent entire nights there, sometimes staying up all night in the car, with his laptop on his lap, in places where Laura would never look for him. He discovered that the CEO, the same man who had kissed his wife in front of everyone without remorse, was also the main person responsible for a scheme to embezzle funds from the company through phantom contracts with shell companies. And more than that, Laura appeared to be responsible for approving the institutional communication of these projects. At first, Ethan wanted to believe that she was just a blind cog in that system. But as he read the archived messages, the hidden records of private meetings, the electronic proof of signatures and the audio saved in automatic backups, the truth imposed itself like a sharp blade on the exposed flesh. She knew. Not only did she know, but she was part of it. Not only did she take part, but she profited from it. An offshore account, opened just over a year ago, received amounts in the name of a foundation for social development events, but Ethan tracked every penny and discovered that part of the money had been used to finance personal trips, stays at resorts and luxury purchases. In the name of the company. In his name. Using your trust as a shield, your good faith as currency. With the evidence gathered, Ethan reached out to an investigative journalist from a small independent network. I didn't want the spotlight, but I needed someone who was ethical enough to follow the trail discreetly until the right moment. The two spent weeks adjusting dates, deciphering codes, connecting names. The plan was not just to expose, but to ensure that the impact was inevitable and devastating. Ethan returned to work with the same serenity as always, greeting his colleagues, having lunch alone, pretending to continue being the same invisible man in the eyes of corporate tensions. Meanwhile, Laura seemed strangely calm, as if the kiss at the party had been forgotten, ignored or absorbed by the complicit silence of someone she believes has enough power to rewrite fantasies. But she started to feel something. Maybe it wasn't guilt, but a discomfort that manifested itself in Ethan's eyes, now cold as reflectionless mirrors. She asked if everything was okay, and he just smiled slightly, as if he were elegantly keeping a secret. He seemed more attentive, more present in everything, as if he were about to do something important. The moment chosen for the revelation was precisely calculated. At the investor alignment meeting, broadcast live to the company's departments, Laura was next to the CEO, dressed in sober tones and with impeccable posture. She began her institutional speech with rehearsed phrases, prepared numbers to convince. He watched her from the back row, discreetly. When she finished, the CEO spoke in his calm tone, talking about growth, ethics and a sustainable future. It was then that the room went dark for a few seconds. The emergency lights came on, and the large screen behind the stage came to life on its own. A sequence of slides began to be displayed, screenshots of bank transactions, contracts signed by both parties, internal messages with compromising phrases, fake invoices. Each new image was accompanied by a simple and direct caption. People began to murmur, their faces turned towards the stage. Laura froze. The CEO tried to maintain control, asked for calm, but his voice failed. The broadcast sound remained on. The technical manager, hired by the journalist, made sure that no one interrupted. The room became a panic zone. Investors demanded explanations. Directors stood up, pointing to those involved. Ethan remained silent. He watched the ruin as if watching a predicted collapse, without feeling moved. Laura, standing, could not say anything. Her eyes searched for Ethan in the middle of the audience. He was there. Motionless. His gaze was different. For the first time, she felt fear. Not of the scandal, but of the man in front of her. The man she betrayed. The man she tried to deceive. The man she underestimated. At the end of the meeting, a task force was set up. Internal audit was called in. Both were immediately removed. The press, already warned in advance by the journalist, began to publish the story with direct headlines and images of the documents shown. The company became the target of a federal investigation. Ethan was called to testify. He took everything. Every folder, every file. Not as personal revenge, but as someone who, after being crushed, decided to rebuild his dignity with real bricks. Late in the afternoon, Laura showed up at their house. She was exhausted, her hair tied up in a mess, her makeup smeared, and her eyes red. She came in without asking. He was sitting on the couch, reading a report. She didn't say hello, she just stood in front of him, her breathing ragged. She said she needed to talk. Ethan looked up slowly, as if he were looking at a stranger. She was crying. She said it wasn't what he thought. That things got out of control. That she didn't want it to end like this. That she got too involved, that she was afraid. That he didn't listen to her anymore. That she felt invisible. That the other man offered his presence, recognition, attention. Ethan listened to everything in silence. After a while, he asked her if she thought love was an excuse for crime. She tried to say that it wasn't like that it all started with small decisions, that the money was just a side effect, that she did it on impulse. He approached her slowly, looked into her eyes and said in a firm, low voice that impulses didn't erase choices. That what she had destroyed wasn't just the marriage, but the trust that justified every second they lived together. And that there was no going back. She fell to the floor, kneeling, begging him not to leave her alone, not to expose everything. Ethan crouched down until he was face to face with her. In the same calm tone, he told her that she had been alone for a long time, she just hadn't realized it. That he wouldn't do anything to her now. The world would do it for him. He stood up, grabbed a folder with the documents that needed to be delivered to the legal department, and walked out the front door without looking back. The sound of the door closing echoed like the end of a story that, for her, seemed to be just beginning. But for him, it was freedom from everything that had bound his life to lies. And, on the way to the car, as night fell, Ethan breathed like someone who was learning to live again. Because what Laura didn't know yet was that the impact of that morning was just the beginning of something even bigger that was about to happen. In the days that followed, the city seemed to breathe in the fall of the two executives as if the air were denser, more charged, as if something that had previously been just a murmur had finally exploded loudly. Ethan was called to give interviews, received partnership proposals from companies that valued his integrity and were attracted to his firm and ethical stance in the face of a crisis that could have ruined anyone else. But he refused them all. He wasn't looking for the spotlight or recognition, he just wanted to distance himself from it all. He asked for an extended leave, discreetly packed his bags and left the house where everything had been built with bricks of love, but which had been torn down by hidden choices. The silence with which he left was more powerful than any speech. In that space, where every corner bore a trace of his time with Laura, there was no longer any point in staying. He opted for a small cottage in another town, isolated among the trees, where he could hear the sound of branches hitting the windows and his own breathing for the first time in years. Laura, on the other hand, was going through a silent breakdown. Not because of the public exposure, she managed to cope with that with makeup and carefully scripted speeches to her lawyers, but because of the emotional vacuum that was forming around her. Friends avoided calling, family members showed embarrassment, and the press camped out in front of the building where she now lived alone. Social media was flooded with judgments and accusations, but none of that hurt as much as the emptiness she felt when she woke up in silence, without the sound of the coffee maker that Ethan turned on every morning, without the small, routine kindnesses that she now understood as the true structure of the love she had neglected. She tried to reconstruct the narrative in her head, to make sense of the decisions she had made, to justify herself in front of her own mirror. At times, she believed the lies she told herself, like a child trying to erase with saliva the scribble she had made with permanent marker. One gray afternoon, weeks after the public exposure, she decided to look for him. Not for revenge or reconquest, deep down, she knew that was beyond any possibility, but for something she still couldn't name. She hit the road without warning, driving for hours, her eyes red and her mind in a spiral. When she reached the cottage, the door was ajar and the smell of burning wood was coming out of the chimney. She knocked lightly, pushed the door open, and found Ethan sitting at the table, writing something down in a notebook. He looked up slowly, with a serene expression that immediately disarmed her. There was no surprise, no rejection, just a respectful silence that lasted for long seconds. Laura asked to come in, and he pointed to a chair. She sat down opposite him, hesitantly, with her fingers intertwined. The sound of the wind filled the spaces that words didn't yet dare to occupy. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, but that she needed to say everything. That I needed him to know what really happened. Ethan remained silent, watching her, and she began to speak. He didn't ask for mercy, but confessed with raw honesty that what started as a professional approach turned into a dangerous game. That the boss used her vulnerability, her desire to feel valued, and that she allowed it. He said that at first it was a thoughtless mistake, but that over time he began to justify each deviation as if it were a necessary exception. Who found herself trapped in a web of vanity, power, and adrenaline. But none of it filled her like the coffees Ethan made or the Sundays spent in shared silence. He said he didn't know at what point he lost track of who he was, but that he now knew that everything he tried to build without him was empty. Ethan listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on her, without anger, without irony. When she finished, there was a thick silence. Then he said he understood. Not the mistake, but the process. That he had spent days trying to answer a question that had been hammering in his head, why? And now, hearing her speak, the question changed. He no longer wanted to know the reason for what she did, but what she was capable of doing from then on with what was left. Laura lowered her head, trying to hold back her tears, saying that she had lost everything and that even so she woke up every day with the feeling that she still had more to lose. Ethan replied that losing was not the problem. That everyone loses something throughout their life. The problem is not knowing what to do with what is left. And there, in front of that broken woman, he understood something new, that his story with her had been beautiful, but also finite. That love can survive many things, but not the absence of integrity. The conversation was long, lasting all night. They talked about things that had never been said before. About small mistakes that had accumulated like dust under the carpet. About postponed dreams. About misinterpreted silences. Laura apologized not only for the betrayal, but for having slowly killed the truth between them. Ethan said he no longer needed requests, that the only thing he demanded now was peace. And that peace meant going their separate ways. When she left that morning, he knew that this was the last chapter of the story they had lived together. But she also understood that she needed to write another story, maybe not with him, maybe not with anyone for a while, but with herself, and with the honesty that she had avoided facing until then. In the following months, Ethan resumed his life away from the corporate world. He dedicated himself to social projects, began teaching workshops on business ethics, and began writing about the behind-the-scenes aspects of power and morality in business. He became a respected figure, but he remained discreet, without social media or glamorous interviews. At a talk for young entrepreneurs, he met a woman named Isabel, who was part of an environmental NGO. Their first glance was not breathtaking, but there was something serene in her presence that reminded him of the kind of peace he had promised to seek. They began to meet by chance and, over time, by choice. She did not ask about the past, and he did not offer any. They talked about the present, about what they could build from now on, like two survivors who learned to value each stone before building a new foundation. Meanwhile, Laura was facing the legal consequences of her involvement in the scandal. She was ordered to pay fines, lost her business rights, and had her assets confiscated. She worked as an independent consultant for a while, trying to slowly rebuild her career. Some colleagues from her old company discreetly kept in touch, recognizing in her a talent that, although misdirected, was real. But her public image was ruined, and she knew it. Still, she decided not to run away. She faced each lawsuit with her head held high, without looking for someone to blame or shifting responsibility. She volunteered at an organization that supported women involved in corporate crimes and began to use her experience as a warning. Some nights, she wrote letters to Ethan that she never sent. Other nights, she looked at old photos and allowed herself to cry. But there was something new in her suffering. It was real, without masks, without justifications. Life went on, as it always does. Ethan, now with a more restrained sparkle in his eyes, learned to laugh again, to trust slowly. Laura, marked by her choices, learned to walk with her wounds exposed, but healing. They never met again after that night at the cabin, but somewhere in time, their stories remained linked. No longer as love, nor as pain, but as a necessary chapter of what they both needed to experience to finally understand who they really were. And perhaps, this was the only form of justice possible. Not the cold justice of the courts, but the silent justice that lives deep within those who have made mistakes and been hurt, and yet, have chosen to continue. The road that took Ethan back to the cabin that cold morning seemed longer than ever, not in distance but in consciousness. The conversation with Laura still echoed like the sound of footsteps inside a narrow corridor, where each memory hit the walls of his mind, generating a dry, cutting sound. She had left without begging to be returned, and that, in a way, was what touched him the most. There were no tricks, no empty promises, just a woman exhausted by her own decisions, stripped of everything she once believed to be a shield. But still, Ethan felt no relief. He felt, yes, the weight of a slow reconstruction, where each step required him to remake his perception of himself and the world. The betrayal, as devastating as it was, had become a fixed point in the past. Now, what occupied him was what to do with the future. A future that he still didn't know if he wanted to share with someone or if he should keep it just for himself as a way of preserving the hard-won peace. The following weeks passed in a meticulous manner. He began attending community meetings, helping small businesses to structure their management in an ethical and transparent manner. His experience had made him a kind of moral reference, although he himself did not feel worthy of that title. He taught about risks, but with the care to remember that the greatest risk is, almost always, the moment you stop paying attention. Some afternoons, I walked long trails in silence, letting tiredness take over my thoughts. In others, he wrote reflections in notebooks that he kept in a locked drawer, as if the act of writing were a private exorcism. He avoided contact with people who linked him to the past, not out of resentment, but out of a need to breathe. He needed to learn to look at himself without the broken mirror Laura had left behind. She, increasingly immersed in the sequence of legal developments, began to realize that the most severe punishment she faced was not the one that came from the courts. The worst part was the look she gave herself in the mirror every morning. A look that refused to lie, that brought back the memory of who she had been and who she had chosen to be the moment she gave in to the power disguised as recognition. The luxuries were gone, the invitations were gone, and the image she had so long cultivated as a prestigious professional had dissolved like dust in the air current of a scandal. Even so, Laura tried to start over. He entered a judicial rehabilitation program, completed community service, and provided free consulting to small entrepreneurs who were facing difficulties due to unfair practices by larger competitors. I didn't do it out of heroism, I did it out of necessity. And even though few recognized his effort, it was the only way he found to keep from going crazy. It was during one of these meetings that she met a young businessman who, with a humble background and raw sincerity, challenged her to see the value in helping without expecting anything in return. Little by little, this new contact became an unlikely friendship, where she didn't need to hide her flaws or keep up appearances. He didn't know who she had been before, and so he treated her opinions with neutrality, without the weight of judgment. For the first time in a long time, Laura experienced the sensation of being heard by someone who expected nothing from her, neither reverence nor justifications. This made her understand that perhaps it was still possible to be useful, even with her past marked like an exposed scar. And amidst the distrust of many, she began to rescue a piece of herself that she had buried under haste and vanity. Meanwhile, Ethan was deepening his relationship with Isabel. It was different from anything he had ever experienced, not because of its intensity, but because of its lightness. There was no urgency or promises, just a constant, silent, and sincere mutual presence. Isabel had a firm gaze and a serenity that did not demand prominence. He liked the way she walked beside him without trying to speed up her pace. They spoke little about the past, but between the lines, they shared scars. There was no intention of healing, only the care not to hurt anymore. That was the basis of their slowly growing bond. One autumn afternoon, sitting under an oak tree, she asked him if he still thought about Laura. Ethan took a while to answer. He said not with longing, but with a strange kind of respect, like someone remembering a battle that almost destroyed everything but that he survived. He said he thought of her as one thinks of a bridge that one has crossed but will never cross again. Isabel nodded with a slight smile and said that was more than most people could achieve. Despite the new phase, the repercussions of the case still echoed. Sporadic reports appeared, especially with the developments in the trial of the former CEO, who was now facing international lawsuits for tax fraud. The evidence collected by Ethan was crucial, and even though he didn't want recognition, he began to be cited in articles and studies on corporate ethics. It was not uncommon to receive invitations to lectures, panels, and courses. And it was at one of these events, aimed at young people in training, that a dilemma arose. One of the students asked him about forgiveness. He asked if he believed that everyone deserved a second chance, even those who betrayed trust in such a cruel way. Ethan was silent for a moment. He said that forgiveness is a choice, not an obligation. That some people can't stand the idea of forgiving because they believe it lessens their pain. Others forgive so as not to carry the weight of resentment. And some, like him, learn to move on without forgiving, but also without punishing. That thought followed him back to the cabin. It stayed with him for days, echoing in the gaps between meetings, between the moments he was alone and the rare phone calls he received. One of them came from an unknown number. When he answered, it was Laura. Her voice was low, slow, as if each word had to be overcome by a mountain. She said she was leaving the country, that she had accepted a position with an international NGO. That she felt she needed to start over somewhere else, with a different story. She didn't ask for permission, or an apology. She just said she needed him to know. Ethan replied that he wanted her to do this not to run away, but to build something worthwhile. She promised him that she would. That this time, everything she did would be clean. Before hanging up, she thanked him. She said that, even if she didn't mean to, he had been her last anchor to what was still worthy of her memory. And then the line went dead. That night, Ethan went for a walk to the lakeside. The sky was clear, and the moon's reflection trembled on the surface of the water. Thought of everything. In the love that was, in the pain that came, in the relief that remained. And he also thought about the doubt that had been haunting him for the last few days: to what extent do someone's mistakes define their entire life? It was a moral dilemma that did not require an immediate answer, but which inevitably shaped his choices from then on. Isabel appeared shortly after. Without saying anything, she just sat next to him, as she usually did when she saw him lost in thought. He handed her a thermos of tea and leaned against her shoulder. And there, without promises, without urgency, he knew that the reconstruction was real. Not because he had erased the past, but because he now had enough courage to not let it be his limit. And on the other side of the ocean, as she walked through the boarding gate with a light suitcase and her eyes still tired, Laura also understood, silently, that the end of the story she lived with Ethan did not need to be a sentence. It could be, perhaps, a start. Not a new relationship, but a new ethic. And as she passed through passport control, she felt, for the first time in a long time, that every step from then on would finally be hers. Even if marked, it would be free. And that, for both of them, was already a new beginning. The arrival of winter brought a new kind of silence to Ethan's life. The cabin that had once been a shelter from solitude had now become a haven of peace. There was a different kind of emptiness in the days that followed Laura's call, something more serene, less oppressive. Her absence no longer hurt as it had before. It was merely the realization that a chapter had closed, a bond undone with no loose ends. But what affected him most during that period was the realization that, no matter how much he had overcome the pain, the scar remained. Not as something that limited his steps, but as an involuntary reminder of what had been. Ethan didn't hate her. Nor did he love her anymore. He simply remembered her with the clarity of someone who knows exactly what he had lost and why. And this awareness, although cruel at times, was also liberating. Isabel, on the other hand, was beginning to occupy a space that did not require comparison or replacement. It was herself, with her distinct story, with her pains and victories. There were days when the two barely exchanged words, but each other's presence was enough. On a cloudy afternoon, during a walk in the countryside, she asked him if he believed that all people deserved to start over. Ethan took a moment, looked away to the horizon and said he didn't know. He said that starting over, for some, was a right. For others, a privilege. And for a few, a penance. Isabel looked at him curiously, not as if she wanted to debate, but as if she wanted to understand what was behind those words. He then continued. He explained that there are people who start over because they were forced to, others because they regretted it, and still others because they had no choice but to rebuild their path with their own pieces. And that perhaps the true beginning again would not be the movement of starting over, but of not repeating what was destroyed before. Isabel smiled discreetly and said that if that was the criteria, Laura seemed to be trying to really start over. Ethan was silent for a moment, then nodded. He said he had learned from mutual friends that she had left the country, that she was involved in a project with real impact, that she had publicly admitted her guilt and was not trying to justify her mistakes. He said that, deep down, he felt a certain respect for that stance. Isabel asked if he felt proud. Ethan laughed softly and said no. Pride was a strong word. But he felt relief. Relief to see that, in the end, despite everything, their story had not been in vain. She had transformed them both. And there was no greater pain than going through something like that and coming out the other side exactly as you went in. That same night, as they lit the fire, Isabel pulled an envelope from her coat pocket. She said it was an invitation. An international conference on corporate ethics, where Ethan had been named as one of the speakers. He thought it was strange that he hadn't been informed, but she explained that she had put his name forward without telling him. She said she thought he deserved to be on that stage, to be heard by those who still needed to learn the difference between power and integrity. Ethan was silent for a few seconds, analyzing the envelope in his hands. He said he didn't know if he wanted to go back to that kind of exposure. Isabel replied that she didn't need to decide now. But that sometimes, giving voice to the pain that had been overcome could save other people from experiencing it. During the days that followed, Ethan thought about it a lot. The conference would take place in the city where it all began. The return would inevitably confront him with memories, places, maybe even people. But there was something inside him that recognized the importance of that gesture. Not for recognition, but for closure. That's why he accepted. He traveled with Isabel and arrived 2 days before the event. The hotel was simple, the hallways discreet, and the view from the window overlooked a park that he and Laura used to pass through on their way to work. It was impossible not to feel a lump tighten in his throat. But it wasn't pain. It was just a memory. One of those memories that comes and goes, without hurting. On the morning of the talk, Ethan wore a dark suit that he saved for special occasions. It wasn't vanity, it was respect for the moment. Isabel accompanied him to the auditorium, holding his hand firmly before letting go. She simply said that he would know what to say. And he did. When he stepped onto the stage and looked out at the packed auditorium, he realized the magnitude of the responsibility. It wasn't just executives and entrepreneurs there. There were students, young people, idealists, and skeptics. People who had doubts similar to the ones he had once had. And then he began to talk. Not about betrayal, not about scandals. But about the value of an ethical decision when no one is looking. He spoke about the importance of remaining whole when everything around you seems corrupt. About the price of looking in the mirror and knowing that, despite everything, you still recognize yourself. At the end of the lecture, he received a standing ovation. Not for being a hero, but for being human. For having made fewer mistakes than I could have, for having got it right when it was most difficult. As he stepped off the stage, he was approached by a young woman who was trembling slightly. He said he was 23 years old, that he dreamed of working with social impact, but that he was afraid of getting lost along the way. He asked what to do when everyone around him seemed to be acting out of convenience. Ethan smiled, put his hand on her shoulder and said that, in these times, the hardest thing is precisely the most necessary, to continue being the person you promised yourself to be before it all began. The young woman thanked him with teary eyes and walked away. That same day, out of the blue, Ethan received a text message on his cell phone. It was from Laura. Just one sentence, short, written in straightforward, unadorned letters: "I saw your talk. Thank you for not turning me into your revenge." He read the message a few times, then deleted it. Not out of anger, but because he didn't need to respond. It was the last piece of a puzzle he had already completed. Laura was now a chapter read. Isabel was the current page. And he was finally the author of his own story. Later that day, while walking through the park with Isabel, he told her about the message. She didn't react with jealousy or distrust. She just held his hand tighter and said, "You're stronger than you think." And then they fell silent, walking side by side until the sun began to set between the trees. The next day, before they returned home, Ethan left a copy of his notebook with reflections in the conference library. He asked that his name not be listed as the author, only as someone who survived and learned. That was what he wanted to leave as a legacy. Not the story of betrayal, nor the exposure of the scandal. But proof that it is possible to go through the worst and still choose not to be the worst. That it is possible to feel hatred and not act on it. That it is possible to be betrayed and still maintain dignity. Because, in the end, that is what remains. The way one chooses to react when everything seems to fall apart. And that choice, unlike love or pain, is always in the hands of those who decide to live with courage. Time has moved forward in an unhurried manner, but it also does not allow anything to remain the same. Months turned into a new year, and everything that seemed urgent dissolved into a softer, more real present. Ethan had returned to the cabin, where the silence no longer bothered him, but welcomed him. He had planted new trees in the surrounding area, built a small wooden studio to write in, and little by little, his routine was shaping up to what he had always wanted to live, not a life of big events, but of small meanings. Isabel had become a calm constant, like the breeze that invades the house through the cracks without asking permission. They didn't live together, they didn't need to. They visited each other frequently, shared meals, walks, projects. The relationship between the two never required promises, just presence. And in that quiet maturity, Ethan found something more valuable than passion: mutual respect, space, freedom, and truth. It was at this pace that he received, for the last time, news involving Laura. She had been nominated by an international organization to receive an award for institutional transparency, a project she led in a developing country, helping to train young female leaders in vulnerable areas. It was a symbolic recognition, but one loaded with meaning. The nomination caused no public reaction, no headlines, just a few discreet notes on industry websites. But for Ethan, that information carried a curious emotional weight. On the one hand, there was the inevitable contradiction: the woman who had once participated in a dirty scheme was now a symbol of ethical restructuring. On the other, there was the realization that even the worst mistakes, when faced truthfully, could become bridges and not walls. He felt neither anger nor pride. Only understanding. Laura had found a path that did not erase what she had done, but that placed her in another place, not as a victim nor as a villain, but as someone who had learned from her own downfall. At the awards ceremony, broadcast online, Laura appeared with her hair tied back and her eyes less bright than before, but deeper. She spoke calmly, without boasting. She admitted that failure had been part of the process. That her wrong choices had taught her more than any academic training. She said that her greatest commitment now was to the truth, especially in front of young people who could still be saved from the path she had once chosen. She didn't mention names, didn't mention her past in detail, but her presence there, in front of people who were unaware of her scandals, was proof that she had managed to rebuild herself inside. When the broadcast ended, Ethan closed his laptop and went to the garden. He looked at the orange-tinted sky and realized that, at that moment, no part of his soul wanted things to have been different. What had happened had shaped them. The pain had not been in vain. That same afternoon, Isabel showed up with a box in her hands. It was an old camera that she had restored and wanted to give him. She said she wanted him to start recording not only thoughts, but images. Because, according to her, there were things that only the silence of photographs could preserve. Ethan smiled, accepted the gift, and placed it on the desk. He asked if she would stay for dinner. She said yes, but that first she wanted to walk with him to the top of the hill. They walked in silence, and when they got there, they sat on the old tree trunk where they had leaned so many times. It was there that she said she intended to move to another country for a while, to participate in an environmental conservation mission. Ethan looked at her for several seconds, trying to decipher if there was some disguised farewell in that proposal. But Isabel was clear, she wanted him to know before she decided. She said she wasn't asking him to go with her, nor to stop her. She just wanted him to know because he was part of everything she was now. Ethan held her hand and told her that love that needed to be held back was not love, it was control. That she was free to go, and that he would be happy to see her grow, even from a distance. Isabel smiled with tears in her eyes. They didn't kiss, nor did they make promises. They just looked at each other for longer than usual, as if they were marking in the other something they wanted to keep forever. When they got back to the cabin, he prepared dinner, and she helped him set the table. They talked about everything and nothing. They slept together, as they had so many other times, but that night there was something deeper, a mutual certainty that, even if their paths diverged, the truth between them would remain intact. In the following weeks, she left. Ethan continued his projects, began photographing landscapes, faces, and details of a life he could not have imagined years before. He published a book with his reflections, anonymously, which began to circulate discreetly among people interested in purposeful leadership. It did not become a bestseller, but it deeply touched those who read it. At one of the launches, he heard a young woman say that the book had prevented her from making the wrong decision in a moment of pressure. Ethan just smiled and did not identify himself as the author. He knew that the value of the book was in the message, not in the authorship. Laura, in turn, continued her journey outside the country. He never tried to get back in touch again. But in an envelope Ethan received a year later, with no return address, there was a single photo. It was the facade of an educational center with a discreet sign that read, "Space for Ethical Reconstruction, for the right to make mistakes and learn." On the back of the photo, a handwritten phrase, "Thank you for letting me learn by myself." Ethan kept the photo between the pages of his favorite book, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder that the impact we have on others doesn't always need a witness. The story of Ethan, Laura and Isabel did not end with a reunion, nor with a spectacular reconciliation. It ended with what many do not consider enough, but which, in the end, is everything: growth. Ethan didn't go back to the past, Laura didn't erase her mistakes, Isabel didn't abandon her mission. Each one followed, wounded and healed, fragile and strong, rebuilt on hard-won truths. And perhaps the most impactful ending was not the cry for justice, but the silence of those who chose to continue with dignity. If this story touched you in any way, share your opinion in the comments. What would you have done in Ethan's place? And in Laura's place? We want to know what you think, because here each story is a mirror. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any narratives like this. And remember, this channel is against any type of betrayal. Our stories are fictional, but the pain they show is real. May they serve as reflection, not as a model. Until the next story.